What if I told you that some of the most daring ninja operations really did happen, not in legend, but recorded in historical documents, diaries, military reports, and feudal chronicles? Forget shadow clones and magic. These are the real missions that shaped wars, toppled castles, and decided the fate of entire clans. Fiction invented very little. History, on the other hand, showed the impossible. Most people know the pop culture ninja, black outfit, vanishing in smoke, throwing stars, cutting through the night. But buried in old clan archives, daimyo records, and regional chronicles, another ninja appears, one that can be traced in ink, not just legend. Feudal lords, in regions like Iga and Kōga, really did record payments to shinobi, reports from shadow agents, and after-action notes that quietly credit unnamed operatives for raids, fires, and stolen information that changed the course of campaigns. These aren't fantasies written centuries later. They are administrative documents written by men who had no interest in myth, only in results. That's where the real gap opens between myth and history. Folklore and modern fiction gave us disappearing super soldiers, magic techniques, and superhuman powers. The records that survive describe something colder and more precise: specialists in intelligence, infiltration, sabotage, and survival. No fireballs, no clones, just people who could slip through enemy lines, map defenses, burn supply depots, and get back out alive. When you strip away the exaggerations, what remains is still astonishing. Missions confirmed in official reports where a handful of agents forced entire armies to move, retreat, or collapse. The strangest part is how little we actually have. Most ninja work was never meant to be written down, and when Japan unified under the Tokugawa, a lot of what existed was intentionally destroyed or buried. Only fragments survived. A reference in a daimyo ledger, a note in a war diary, a line in a castle report. But when historians line those fragments up, a pattern emerges of disciplined professionals, used repeatedly at critical moments, whose impact was far larger than their numbers suggest. If you want to see the real missions that history was forced to admit happened, operations so effective they couldn't be erased, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Because once you look at what the documents actually say, another question appears in the margins. If these are the missions that survived, what incredible operations were carried out so perfectly that history never noticed them at all? The first clear references to shinobi as a distinct class of operative appear in 15th century documents, particularly during the chaotic Nanbokucho period when rival imperial courts tore Japan apart. The Taiheki, a chronicle written in the 14th century, mentions covert agents employed by both the northern and southern courts, describing tactics that look unmistakably like early espionage, night raids, infiltrations, and intelligence gathering that didn't fit the samurai code of open combat. By the time the Sengoku period erupted in the late 1400s, the word shinobi was being used consistently in military records to describe specialists whose job was stealth, not honor. Two texts stand as pillars of documented ninja knowledge: the Bansenshukai and the Shoninki. The Bansenshukai, compiled in 1676 by Fujibayashi Yasutake, is the most comprehensive ninja manual that survived. It wasn't written during the height of ninja activity, but after, an attempt to preserve techniques, philosophies, and operational methods as the profession faded. A copy was even presented to the Tokugawa shogunate in 1789, not as fiction, but as a real record of shinobi practice from Iga and Kōga families. The Shoninki, written in 1681 by Natori Masatake, focuses on espionage strategies from Kishu province and sits alongside the Bansenshukai as one of three major surviving ninja writings. These aren't legend collections, they're tactical manuals, grounded in Chinese military philosophy like Sun Tzu's Art of War, adapted for Japanese conditions. What becomes clear from these sources is that shinobi had an official function. intelligence agents embedded in the military structures of feudal lords. They weren't freelance assassins wandering the countryside. They were employed, often on retainer, by daimyo, who understood that wars were won as much by information as by swords. A lord needed to know enemy troop movements, supply routes, internal dissent, and castle defenses before committing forces. Sending a shinobi to gather that intelligence was cheaper, faster, and often more decisive than a full military campaign. The Nanbokucho period provides some of the earliest mission descriptions. In 1487, shinobi from Iga and Kōga conducted joint operations that brought them significant fame. Later, in 1541, a coordinated infiltration saw 70 to 80 ninja agents from both regions penetrate Kasagi Castle, set fires, and capture key defensive positions, all recorded in chronicles of the time. These weren't myths added centuries later. They were battlefield reports written by people who witnessed or ordered the operations. Daimyo maintained shinobi as invisible assets for one simple reason. They provided strategic options that conventional forces couldn't. A samurai army was visible, expensive, and bound by codes of conduct that limited tactical flexibility. A shinobi team was invisible, deniable, and could operate in ways that bypassed those limitations entirely. Need to know if an alliance is real or a trap? Send a shinobi. Need a supply convoy delayed without open battle? Send a shinobi. Need someone important dead without triggering a blood feud? You already know the answer. The organization of Iga and Kōga clans was decentralized but effective. These weren't hierarchical armies with generals and soldiers. They were networks of jisamurai, farmer warrior families living in remote mountainous regions that central authority barely reached. Iga and Kōga developed as semi-autonomous confederations, bound by mutual defense pacts and shared expertise. Each family specialized in certain skills, and when larger operations were needed, they coordinated through councils and shared intelligence. This structure made them resilient. There was no single leader to capture, no central base to destroy. Communication was critical and highly sophisticated. Secret messengers moved between villages and clients using routes only locals knew. Maps were coded, messages hidden in objects or written in ciphers that required keys both sender and receiver possessed. Some intelligence was passed orally, never written down, to avoid interception. When documents did exist, they used terminology and references that outsiders couldn't decode without context. This operational security is part of why so few records survived, and why the ones that did are fragmentary. The distinction between regular warriors and shinobi specialists was clear to those who employed them. Samurai fought for honor, reputation, and idealized codes of conduct. Shinobi fought to complete objectives by any effective means: deception, poison, sabotage, disguise, psychological manipulation. That didn't make them dishonorable in the eyes of pragmatic warlords. It made them necessary. A samurai would die rather than retreat dishonorably. A shinobi would fake death, vanish, and return to try again. Both had value, but only one could slip into an enemy castle, steal battle plans, and walk out the front gate the next morning disguised as a servant. And that brings us to one of the most documented and desperate moments in ninja history, when the full weight of Japan's most powerful warlord turned toward Iga, determined to crush the shinobi clans completely, and found that erasing shadows is far harder than burning villages. Iga province sat in the mountains of central Japan, isolated and fiercely independent, too independent for Oda Nobunaga, the warlord who intended to unify the country under his banner, whether through diplomacy or total annihilation. Between 1560 and 1581, Iga became a laboratory where ninja tactics clashed directly with overwhelming military force, and the records, both from Iga survivors and Oda chroniclers, document a resistance that should have been crushed in weeks but lasted years. The first serious invasion attempt came in 1579, led by Oda Nobukatsu, Nobunaga's second son. Nobukatsu commanded a force of roughly 8,000 to 10,000 troops, marching into Iga's mountainous terrain, expecting quick submission from what he saw as a collection of disorganized peasant villages. Official Oda records describe what happened next in language that barely conceals frustration. The invasion stalled almost immediately. Conventional tactics, marching columns, supply trains, organized encampments, became liabilities in country the defenders knew intimately, and the invaders didn't understand at all. Iga's resistance wasn't a single army meeting Oda forces in open battle. It was decentralized guerrilla warfare conducted by shinobi families, coordinating through pre-established networks. Chronicles from the period describe night raids on Oda camps, supply depots burned before dawn, sentries found dead without anyone hearing a sound, and entire units harassed by attackers who vanished into forests and ridges the moment pursuit began. These weren't random bandit attacks. They were calculated operations designed to bleed the invaders slowly, forcing them to divert resources to defense and making every forward movement exhausting and dangerous. Sabotage was constant and documented across multiple sources. Bridges collapsed under marching troops. Water sources were poisoned or fouled. Food stores went up in flames. Arrows came from tree lines where no one could be seen. Oda soldiers reported hearing movement in the dark, but finding nothing when they investigated. The psychological toll was as important as the physical damage. An army that can't sleep, can't trust its surroundings, and can't predict where the next attack will come from, loses cohesion fast, no matter how large it is. Communication between Iga villages was the backbone of their defense. Messengers moved through hidden trails, carrying intelligence about Oda troop positions, planned movements, and weak points in their formations. Signals were passed using fires on hilltops, codes understood only by locals. Councils of family heads coordinated responses, deciding which units would strike where and when, ensuring that even as one group withdrew, another was ready to hit the enemy from a different angle. This level of coordination required trust, infrastructure, and operational discipline, all of which Iga had built over generations. The strategic error Nobunaga's forces made, and which later analyses reveal clearly, was treating Iga like a conventional military target. They expected fortified positions to besiege, supply lines to cut, and leadership to decapitate. Iga offered none of those. There was no central command post to capture, no single lord whose defeat would end resistance, no fixed battleground where superior numbers guaranteed victory. The entire province was the battlefield, and every resident was a potential operative or supporter. Oda columns marched into a place where the terrain itself seemed hostile, and by the time they realized they were fighting a different kind of war, they'd already lost the first round. The 1579 invasion failed spectacularly. Nobukatsu's forces were forced to retreat with heavy casualties and nothing to show for it. Oda chroniclers recorded the defeat with barely disguised embarrassment, noting that the mountain people resisted with unexpected cunning and that conventional tactics proved insufficient. For Iga, it was a temporary victory, but they knew it wouldn't be the last attempt. For 2 years, Iga's shinobi clans delayed the inevitable through intelligence, sabotage, and relentless harassment of any force that approached their borders. They bought time, preserved their families, and made it clear that conquering them would cost far more than most warlords were willing to pay. But Oda Nobunaga wasn't most warlords, and he took the defeat of his son personally. In 1581, Nobunaga returned with overwhelming force, an army estimated between 40,000 and 60,000 soldiers, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. This time there was no subtlety, no attempt at negotiation. It was extermination. Historical records from both sides describe the invasion as methodical and brutal. Villages were burned, families were slaughtered. The guerrilla tactics that had worked against smaller forces couldn't stop a military operation this massive and this ruthless. The final destruction of Iga is documented in horrifying detail. Oda forces swept through the province systematically, destroying everything that could support resistance: homes, shrines, food stores, even the infrastructure that had allowed covert communication. Some shinobi families fought to the end, others fled into deeper mountains or scattered across Japan, taking their skills and knowledge into exile. By the time Nobunaga's forces withdrew, Iga, as a cohesive network, was shattered. But the survivors carried something with them, proof that even the most powerful warlord in Japan couldn't crush them easily, and the knowledge that their tactics, when used correctly, could hold off armies 10 times their size. That reputation would follow them into new employment, new alliances, and eventually into the service of the very clans that had tried to destroy them. Because less than a year after Iga's destruction, Nobunaga himself would be dead, betrayed, ambushed, and forced to commit suicide in a burning temple. And in the chaos that followed, one of Japan's most famous ninja-assisted operations would save the life of the man who would eventually rule the entire country. In 1597, Ueda Castle in Shinano Province became the stage for one of the most meticulously documented ninja operations in Japanese history, an infiltration so successful that even Tokugawa records had to acknowledge it happened, even if they preferred not to dwell on the details. The Sanada clan, led by the brilliant strategist Sanada Yukimura and his father Masayuki, controlled Ueda and had developed a reputation for punching far above their weight in conflicts with larger powers. What made them particularly dangerous wasn't just battlefield tactics. It was their extensive use of shinobi networks, especially agents with roots in the destroyed Iga and Kōga regions, who had found new employment with clans willing to pay for their expertise. Sanada archives, preserved through family records and later historical compilations, explicitly credit ninja operatives with intelligence gathering and sabotage operations that kept the castle defensible against numerically superior forces. The 1597 mission centered on a Tokugawa expeditionary force preparing to besiege Ueda. Tokugawa Hidetada, leading the operation, commanded thousands of troops supported by detailed maps and logistical planning. But those maps became liabilities when Sanada shinobi infiltrated Tokugawa camps and systematically altered them. Routes were subtly changed. Trails marked as passable were actually dead ends. River crossings listed as shallow turned out to be deep and treacherous. And approach roads that looked direct led into difficult terrain that slowed marching columns and exposed them to ambush. Military reports from the Tokugawa side note unexpected geographical difficulties and unreliable intelligence without explicitly admitting their maps had been sabotaged, but the pattern is clear when cross-referenced with Sanada sources. How did the ninja know patrol schedules and guard rotations with such precision? The answer lies in long-term infiltration documented in both the Ninpiden, a ninja instructional text, and in operational reports. Shinobi agents had been placed inside Tokugawa logistics and support units weeks or even months before the siege began. Not as soldiers, but as porters, cooks, stable hands, and camp followers, roles so low status that samurai officers paid them almost no attention. These operatives observed, memorized, and reported back through covert channels which units patrolled when, where sentries were stationed, how alert guards were at different hours, and which officers were strict versus which were lazy. The theft of strategic documents is confirmed in multiple sources. Tokugawa records note the mysterious disappearance of correspondence, supply manifests, and tactical orders from secured areas within their own camp. At the time, it was blamed on carelessness or internal disputes. Sanada records are more direct. Shinobi agents assigned to document theft successfully penetrated command tents, copied or stole orders, and delivered them to Sanada leadership, giving them a real-time picture of Tokugawa intentions, force disposition, and logistical vulnerabilities. Bridge sabotage appears in both Sanada clan histories and in Tokugawa military reports, though phrased very differently. Tokugawa accounts describe bridges along their approach routes collapsing unexpectedly or being found destroyed by unknown parties, forcing time-consuming detours. Sanada sources are blunt. Ninja teams were dispatched to weaken key bridges along Tokugawa supply lines, using techniques that made the damage invisible until weight was applied. Supports were partially cut, fasteners loosened, and structural beams weakened just enough that when wagons or troops crossed, the bridges failed, appearing as accidents rather than sabotage, but achieving the same strategic result. Infiltration techniques described in the Ninpiden match, the tactics used at Ueda almost exactly. The manual emphasizes patience, mundane cover identities, and the importance of blending into the background of military operations. It describes how to move through camps at night by timing movements to coincide with guard changes, how to use weather and darkness for concealment, and how to create diversions that draw attention away from the real objective. These weren't theoretical exercises. They were documented practices, refined over generations, and deployed successfully in operations like Ueda. What makes this mission remarkable in the historical record is the documented withdrawal without casualties. Tokugawa reports, compiled after the campaign, note that despite heightened security following the discovery of sabotage and intelligence leaks, they never captured a single confirmed Sanada ninja operative during the siege preparations. The agents completed their tasks and extracted successfully, leaving Tokugawa forces aware they'd been compromised, but unable to do anything about it. That level of operational security, maintained under pressure, speaks to both the training of the operatives and the discipline of the network supporting them. The impact on Ueda's defense was decisive. Armed with accurate intelligence about Tokugawa plans, troop strength and morale, the Sanada were able to position their much smaller force with precision. They knew when and where attacks would come, which routes were being used, and where supply lines were weakest. When the siege began, it quickly bogged down, not because Ueda's walls were particularly strong, but because every Tokugawa move was anticipated, countered or disrupted before it could develop momentum. Eventually, Hidetada withdrew, unable to justify the cost of continuing an operation that had been compromised from the beginning. Sanada Yukimura's reputation as a master strategist rests in part on victories like Ueda, but the records make clear that his brilliance was amplified by an intelligence network that gave him information his enemies didn't know he had. It's a pattern that repeats across confirmed ninja operations. The difference between success and failure often wasn't the size of armies, but the quality of information one side possessed and the other didn't. And if ninja operatives could shape the outcome of sieges in peacetime conflicts, imagine what they could do when the stakes were higher, when the survival of Japan's future shogun hung on a single desperate escape through hostile territory, and only one network had the knowledge and reach to pull it off. In 1582, Tokugawa Ieyasu, one of Japan's most powerful daimyo and future shogun, found himself in the worst possible position. Trapped in hostile territory with a tiny retinue, surrounded by enemies who would pay fortunes for his head, and no clear path to safety. What saved him is documented across multiple historical sources as one of the most famous ninja-assisted operations in Japanese history, the escape through Iga, led by a man whose name became synonymous with shinobi legend, Hattori Hanzo. The crisis began with the Honnoji incident in June 1582, when Oda Nobunaga was betrayed and forced to commit suicide by his own vassal, Akechi Mitsuhide. At the time, Ieyasu was in Sakai near Osaka, far from his home territory and with only a small escort. The news of Nobunaga's death threw the region into chaos. Mitsuhide's forces were hunting anyone connected to Nobunaga's alliance network, and the roads between Sakai and Ieyasu's domain in Mikawa were suddenly crawling with soldiers, bandits, and opportunists looking to profit from the power vacuum. Traveling openly would be suicide. Ieyasu needed to cross nearly 200 kilometers of dangerous terrain to reach safety, and he needed to do it invisibly. Enter Hattori Hanzo, a samurai from a family with deep ties to the Iga shinobi clans. Hanzo had served the Tokugawa for years, and while he himself wasn't purely a ninja in the shadow warrior sense, he commanded the loyalty and cooperation of networks throughout Iga and Kōga. When Ieyasu's survival hung in the balance, Hanzo activated those networks. Historical records, including Tokugawa family chronicles and regional histories from Iga, confirm that Hanzo mobilized shinobi guides who knew every back trail, mountain pass, and hidden route through the region. These weren't public roads. They were paths used by locals, smugglers, and operatives who needed to move unseen. The guides led Ieyasu's party through forests so dense that pursuers couldn't follow in formation, across rivers at fords only locals knew existed, and around checkpoints and patrol routes that would have trapped a conventional escape attempt. The journey, often called the Iga Crossing or Iga Go, is documented in multiple sources with consistent core details. Ieyasu traveled light, disguised as a merchant or pilgrim, depending on the account, moving primarily at night and resting in safe houses arranged by Hanzo's network. Shinobi scouts ranged ahead, reporting on enemy positions and clearing obstacles. At critical moments, diversions were created, fires set in one direction to draw patrols away, false sightings planted to send searchers down wrong paths. Every technique in the shinobi toolkit was deployed to keep Ieyasu invisible and moving. Accounts from both Tokugawa sources and regional chronicles described narrow escapes, moments where the party had to hide in forests as hostile troops passed meters away, river crossings made under cover of storms, and tense negotiations with local powers who could have betrayed them for reward but chose neutrality or assistance instead, often because Hanzo's network had leverage, relationships, or simply inspired enough respect or fear that cooperation was the safer bet. The strategic importance of this mission cannot be overstated. If Ieyasu had been captured or killed during the chaos following Nobunaga's death, Japanese history changes completely. He wouldn't have been present to consolidate power, wouldn't have fought at Sekigahara, and wouldn't have established the Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Japan for over 250 years. The escape through Iga, facilitated by shinobi networks, was the thread that kept that future intact. The Tokugawa regime preserved these records deliberately, not to glorify ninja as mythical heroes, but to acknowledge a debt and to legitimize Hattori Hanzo's elevated status within the new government. After Ieyasu secured power, Hanzo and the Iga Kōga shinobi who had helped him were rewarded with lands, positions, and official roles. Hanzo became the leader of the Iga Gumi, an elite unit of former ninja serving as guards and intelligence operatives for the shogunate. It was one of the rare moments where shinobi transitioned from shadowy mercenaries to recognized, if still secretive, state assets. This formalization marked a turning point. Ninja went from being tools hired by competing warlords to becoming integrated into the Tokugawa power structure. They were no longer just external contractors. They were part of the system, though still operating in its shadows. Records from the early Edo period show payments to Iga and Kōga families, assignments for surveillance and intelligence work, and the establishment of protocols that transformed shinobi from outlaws into a quasi-official secret service. The Iga Crossing became a foundational legend for the Tokugawa clan, a story of loyalty, skill, and survival that reinforced the legitimacy of their rule and justified the continued employment of shinobi in an era that was supposed to be about order and peace. It also ensured that the records survived. When you owe your dynasty to a covert operation, you don't let that story disappear, even if you sanitize some of the darker details. But as Japan moved toward unification and internal peace, the role of ninja evolved yet again, from rescuers of future shoguns to something far more ambiguous. Agents sent beyond Japan's borders, into foreign wars where the rules were even less clear and the documentation even more fragmented. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi launched his catastrophic invasion of Korea in 1592, He brought more than samurai armies and siege weapons. He brought shinobi operatives tasked with intelligence gathering, sabotage, and reconnaissance in a foreign land where Japanese forces were linguistically, culturally, and geographically blind. The records from this campaign are fragmented and politically sensitive, but they exist in both Japanese war diaries and Korean defensive reports, revealing ninja operations conducted thousands of kilometers from their mountain homelands. Japanese military documents from the invasion, compiled by various daimyo and later preserved in clan archives, explicitly mention the deployment of shinobi units for advance reconnaissance. Before major troop movements, small teams were sent ahead to map terrain, identify water sources, locate enemy positions, and assess defensive structures. These weren't samurai scouts moving in formation. They were covert operatives moving alone or in pairs, often at night, tasked with returning intelligence without engaging in combat, unless absolutely necessary. Infiltration into Korean lines is documented in reports from commanders like Kato Kiyomasa and Konishi Yukinaga, both of whom used intelligence operatives extensively during the campaign. Some shinobi posed as merchants, refugees, or neutral parties to gain access to Korean-controlled areas. Others simply moved through enemy territory unseen, observing troop strengths, supply depots, and communication routes. The intelligence they gathered, though not always accurate given language barriers and unfamiliar geography, gave Japanese forces critical information about where resistance would be strongest and where gaps could be exploited. Sabotage operations are described in multiple Japanese sources, though often euphemistically. References to supply disruptions, unexplained fires, and enemy confusion appear in war diaries without explicitly stating shinobi involvement, but the patterns match known ninja tactics. Korean granaries burned before Japanese forces arrived to seize them. Bridges collapsed at inconvenient moments for defenders trying to reinforce positions. Arrows and incendiary devices appeared from unexpected angles during night battles, suggesting small, mobile units operating independently of main forces. Night operations were documented by Japanese generals who relied heavily on shinobi capabilities in unfamiliar terrain. Diaries describe teams sent to create disturbances in Korean encampments, lighting fires to trigger false alarms, making noise to simulate larger forces, and generally sowing confusion that made Korean defenders overestimate Japanese numbers or misallocate resources. These psychological tactics, refined in Japan's civil wars, were exported to the Korean theater with mixed effectiveness. Terrain and weather in Korea presented challenges Iga and Kōga operatives weren't accustomed to. Map collection and naval intelligence became critical as the campaign dragged on, and Japanese supply lines stretched dangerously thin. Shinobi operatives were tasked with sketching coastlines, identifying safe harbors, and locating river routes that could support logistical operations. Some reports mention agents being inserted near Korean ports to observe warship movements and report back on naval capabilities, intelligence that proved tragically insufficient when Admiral Yi Sun-sin's turtle ships devastated Japanese fleets, but which at least gave commanders some advance warning of the threat they faced. Evasion tactics appear in accounts from operatives who survived missions deep in hostile territory. One fragmentary report describes a shinobi team trapped behind Korean lines after a Japanese advance stalled, surviving for weeks by moving only at night, avoiding populated areas, and living off foraged food until they could rejoin friendly forces. Another account mentions an operative who posed as a Buddhist monk traveling between temples, using that cover to cross Korean defensive lines multiple times while carrying encoded intelligence about troop deployments. Korean records add a different perspective. Chronicles from the Joseon court and military reports describe Japanese spies and saboteurs operating in ways that clearly indicate trained covert operatives rather than ordinary soldiers. Korean defenders reported finding evidence of surveillance, disturbed ground near encampments, signs of overnight observation posts in tree lines, and occasional captures of Japanese individuals who couldn't adequately explain their presence in restricted areas and who carried no identifying marks or documents. Some of these prisoners, under interrogation, revealed training and knowledge consistent with shinobi methodology, though Korean sources don't use that specific term. The controversy lies in assessing impact. Japanese sources tend to credit shinobi intelligence with enabling several tactical successes, particularly in the early phases of the invasion when Korean forces were disorganized and Japanese mobility was high. Korean sources, by contrast, emphasized that no amount of espionage could overcome the strategic disaster of overextended supply lines, hostile terrain, and Yi Sun-sin's naval dominance. Both perspectives have merit. Shinobi operations likely provided useful tactical intelligence, but couldn't fix the fundamental problems with Hideyoshi's strategy. Cross-referencing Japanese and Korean archives reveals interesting overlaps. Specific incidents, unexplained fires in Korean supply depots, the capture of isolated Japanese operatives, night raids that seemed too well informed about defensive layouts, appear in both sets of records, described from opposite sides, but clearly referring to the same events. This cross-confirmation strengthens the case that shinobi operations were real and active during the Korean campaigns, even if their overall strategic value remains debatable. What's undeniable is that this foreign deployment pushed ninja tactics into entirely new contexts, operating without local support networks, navigating unfamiliar languages and cultures, and functioning as long-range intelligence assets in a way that prefigured modern special operations doctrine. It was also one of the last major foreign deployments of shinobi before Japan turned inward under Tokugawa rule. Because once the wars ended and peace settled over Japan, the question facing every shinobi clan was simple and terrifying. What use is a shadow warrior when there are no more wars to fight? Anzuchi Castle was Oda Nobunaga's masterpiece, a towering symbol of his power, filled with treasures, strategic documents, and the administrative heart of his ambitions to unify Japan. When Nobunaga died at Honnoji in June 1582, Azuchi became a target, and what happened in the chaotic days that followed is documented in fragments that reveal one of the most brazen infiltrations in ninja history. Within hours of Nobunaga's death, word spread that Akechi Mitsuhide's forces were moving to consolidate control, and that Azuchi, undefended and suddenly masterless, was vulnerable. Multiple sources, including later Tokugawa records and regional chronicles, describe a scramble by various factions to secure or destroy what the castle contained. Among those who moved fastest were shinobi operatives, though exactly who hired them and for what specific purpose remains murky. What's clear is that infiltration occurred before the castle burned. The theft of documents is referenced in inventories compiled after Azuchi's fall. Official records note that key correspondence, land registers, alliance agreements, and strategic maps that should have been in Nobunaga's archives were missing when loyalists attempted to secure the site. Some of this material later surfaced in the hands of rival clans, evidence that it hadn't simply burned, but had been deliberately extracted. The precision of what was taken, high-value intelligence rather than random looting, suggests professionals, not opportunistic thieves. Contemporary accounts describe confusion during Azuchi's final days, people fleeing, soldiers entering and leaving, fires being set either accidentally or as cover for other activities. Within that chaos, multiple sources mention individuals who seemed out of place, servants who weren't recognized, travelers who entered restricted areas, laborers who moved with unusual purpose. These descriptions, compiled from witness statements recorded by investigators trying to piece together what happened, fit the profile of shinobi operatives using disguise and social camouflage to blend into the chaos. Evidence of cooperation between shinobi and dissident samurai appears in later confessions and intelligence reports. Some of Nobunaga's former retainers, hedging their bets in the power vacuum, allegedly hired or collaborated with ninja agents to secure documents that could be used as leverage in negotiations with emerging powers like Toyotomi Hideyoshi or Tokugawa Ieyasu. This wasn't betrayal in the classic sense. It was survival politics, and shinobi were tools available to anyone willing to pay or offer future protection. Recovered objects add another layer of confirmation. Specific items known to have been in Azuchi, certain ceremonial swords, seals, and correspondence, were later documented in the possession of families and clans with known connections to Iga and Kōga networks. How those objects traveled from a burning castle to distant provinces, bypassing checkpoints and hostile forces, is never fully explained in official records. But the implication is clear. Someone moved them covertly, and that someone had the skills and roots to do it invisibly. Techniques described in the Bansenshukai align remarkably well with what fragmentary accounts describe at Azuchi. The manual discusses infiltration during chaos, using fire and panic as cover, adopting multiple disguises in sequence, and extracting with stolen materials hidden in innocuous containers or clothing. One section specifically addresses how to move through a collapsing power structure by appearing to belong to whichever faction is dominant in a given moment. Exactly the kind of adaptive camouflage that would be necessary during Azuchi's fall. The operatives themselves vanished from all records after the mission. No arrests were made, no public acknowledgement of infiltration appears in official sources, and no names surface in connection with the thefts. This operational silence is both expected and telling. Successful shinobi operations were designed to leave no trace of the agents involved. The fact that we know the infiltration happened but can't name a single participant is, perversely, evidence of how well it was executed. Why this mission became a historical reference point is partly due to its scale and audacity, penetrating the seat of Japan's most powerful warlord at the moment of maximum chaos, and partly because it illustrated a broader truth about the Sengoku period. Official power and shadow operations were inseparable. Samurai controlled castles and armies, but shinobi controlled information flow, and in moments of transition, information was often more valuable than swords. The Azuchi operation also became a teaching case, referenced in later ninja training materials and strategic discussions, precisely because it demonstrated successful extraction under the worst conditions. Hostile territory, time pressure, multiple competing factions, and the added complication of a structure literally burning around the operatives. If you could infiltrate and extract from Azuchi in 1582, you could handle almost any scenario. What makes this mission particularly significant in the documented history of ninja operations is that it sits at the intersection of verified facts and deliberate obscurity. We know it happened because the missing documents and objects prove it. We know professionals were involved because amateurs don't execute that cleanly. But we don't know, and likely never will, exactly who ordered it, who carried it out, or what happened to the intelligence once it was delivered. And that pattern, verified impact with invisible operators, would define the next phase of ninja employment, when the wars that had sustained their profession finally ended and they transitioned from freelance operatives into something more controlled, more institutional, and in some ways more dangerous: the secret police of a unified Japan. The Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 decided who would rule Japan for the next 250 years. On the surface, it was a clash of armies, roughly 160,000 warriors divided between the Eastern Army led by Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Western Army under Ishida Mitsunari. But beneath the banners and battlefield formations, another war was already being fought by shinobi operatives working for both sides, gathering intelligence that would shape decisions before a single arrow was fired. Both factions employed ninja agents extensively in the months leading up to Sekigahara, and records from multiple daimyo archives confirm it. Tokugawa sources, though carefully edited, reference payments to special scouts and intelligence contractors from Iga and Kōga, euphemisms for shinobi, whose names were deliberately omitted from official rosters. Western Army records are sparser, having been largely destroyed or suppressed after their defeat, but surviving fragments from allied clans mention similar arrangements. Agents hired to monitor enemy movements and report back through covert channels. Troop movement reports were critical in an era before radio or telegraph. Knowing where your enemy was, how fast they were moving, and in what strength could mean the difference between ambush and victory. Shinobi operatives shadowed marching columns, counted banners, estimated supply train lengths, and noted the condition of soldiers, details that allowed commanders to calculate not just enemy strength, but readiness and morale. These reports were carried by runners, often shinobi themselves, moving faster than conventional messengers because they used routes and shortcuts that avoided official roads and checkpoints. Message encoding was sophisticated and documented in multiple sources. Intelligence couldn't be sent in plain language. If a messenger was captured, the information would be compromised. So shinobi used ciphers, coded language, and steganography. The Bansenshukai describes methods where messages were hidden in clothing, woven into fabric patterns, sewn into hems, or written on cloth that could be disguised as bandages or worn under outer garments. Other messages were encoded in seemingly innocent objects, the arrangement of items in a pouch, the type of knot tied on a cord, or symbols carved into wooden tokens that meant nothing to outsiders but conveyed precise information to trained readers. Infiltration of Ishida Mitsunari's Western Army is confirmed in Tokugawa records that describe intelligence received from sources within enemy councils. Some of this came from samurai informants or wavering allies, but operational details, guard rotations, camp layouts, internal disputes suggest shinobi placement at lower levels of the Western Army's logistics and support structure. Servants, porters, and auxiliary personnel were rarely vetted as carefully as combat troops, making them ideal cover for long-term intelligence gathering. The data gathered by these operatives directly influenced battlefield decisions. Ieyasu knew, days before the battle, which Western Army commanders were wavering in their loyalty, information that allowed him to send secret messages offering better terms if they switched sides at the critical moment. That betrayal, most famously by Kobayakawa Hideaki, was the turning point at Sekigahara. While Kobayakawa's motives were his own, the fact that Ieyasu knew exactly when and how to pressure him suggests intelligence preparation that went far beyond battlefield observation. Tokugawa archives preserved after the victory contain references to intelligence operations that are remarkable for what they don't say. Entries note, "Intelligence received," or "enemy disposition confirmed," without explaining how that information was obtained. Payments are recorded to individuals identified only by region, Iga, Kōga, or role, scout, messenger, with no names attached. This deliberate vagueness is itself evidence. The Tokugawa wanted credit for effective intelligence, but didn't want to create a paper trail that identified specific operatives or methods. Standard practice for covert operations that might be needed again. Independent agents, shinobi not formally attached to either side, also played a role, though their activities are harder to document. Some operatives sold information to whoever paid more, providing intelligence to both Eastern and Western forces at different times. Others operated on behalf of smaller clans, trying to hedge their bets, gathering information they could use to decide which side to support at the last possible moment. This mercenary layer added complexity. Not all intelligence was reliable, and commanders had to assess whether reports came from trusted networks or potentially compromised sources. After Ieyasu's victory, many records simply vanished. The Tokugawa regime spent decades consolidating power and rewriting history to emphasize their legitimacy and the inevitability of their triumph. Intelligence operations that showed how much their victory depended on espionage, betrayal, and covert manipulation didn't fit that narrative. So documents were edited, names were removed, and entire operational details were reduced to vague references that historians have spent centuries trying to decode. What survives suggests that Sekigahara wasn't just one on the battlefield. It was one in the weeks and months before, when shinobi operatives mapped the psychological and political terrain, identified weaknesses, and fed Ieyasu the information he needed to turn potential enemies into last-minute allies. The samurai fought the battle. The ninja ensured the outcome. And once that outcome was secured, once Japan entered an era of enforced peace under Tokugawa rule, the question facing every shinobi operative became existential. What happens to warriors trained for shadows when the only war left to fight is against internal dissent, and you're the ones tasked with waging it? When Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan and established the shogunate in 1603, the age of open warfare ended, and with it, the golden age of the shinobi. But the ninja didn't disappear overnight. Instead, they transformed, their skills redirected from battlefield intelligence to internal surveillance, and the records from the early Edo period document this slow, deliberate transition from shadow warriors to secret police. The decline began with simple economics. There were no more rival daimyo hiring for espionage, no more castles to infiltrate, no more wars requiring covert operations. The Tokugawa regime imposed strict controls on military activity, forbidding private armies and punishing any lord suspected of plotting rebellion. In this environment, the freelance shinobi who had thrived during the Sengoku period found their services unwanted, except by the shogunate itself, which understood that maintaining peace required knowing what everyone was thinking, planning, and whispering behind closed doors. Documented missions from the early 1600s show shinobi repurposed as internal security agents. Tokugawa records reference the Oniwaban, a covert intelligence unit staffed largely by former Iga and Kōga operatives tasked with surveillance, investigation, and counterintelligence within Japan. These weren't the dramatic infiltrations of wartime. They were long-term placements, agents embedded in cities, monitoring merchant activity, watching for signs of Christian missionary work, which the shogunate had banned, and reporting on any daimyo whose behavior seemed suspicious. Urban surveillance became a primary function. Shinobi operatives posed as tradesmen, entertainers, monks, or laborers in major cities like Edo, modern Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka. Their job wasn't to sabotage or kill, it was to listen, observe, and report. Who was meeting with whom? Which merchants were unusually wealthy? Were there gatherings that could indicate conspiracy? This kind of work required the same core skills as wartime espionage, blending in, gathering information, communicating covertly, but applied to a peacetime surveillance state rather than battlefield intelligence. The use of ninja to investigate suspect lords is documented in shogunate administrative records. When a daimyo's loyalty was questioned, the Tokugawa didn't send armies. They sent investigators, often former shinobi, to pose as servants, retainers, or visitors and report on the lord's activities, conversations, and alliances. These investigations could take months, with agents living inside the suspect's household, slowly building a picture of whether the concerns were justified. If evidence of disloyalty was found, the shogunate could act preemptively, confiscating lands or forcing the lord into retirement before open rebellion became possible. The gradual dissolution of Iga and Kōga as independent power centers was deliberate Tokugawa policy. After using these clans to secure power, the shogunate didn't want them remaining as autonomous networks that could be turned against the state. Families were dispersed, lands redistributed, and the next generation encouraged or forced to enter civilian professions. Some former shinobi became low-ranking samurai in Tokugawa service. Others faded into merchant or farming classes. The communal infrastructure that had sustained covert operations, shared training, coded communication, mutual support, was systematically dismantled. Final records of active ninja operations date to the mid to late 1600s. The Bansenshukai, compiled in 1676, was itself a preservation effort, an attempt to record techniques and knowledge before the last practitioners died and the traditions vanished. By the time the manual was presented to the Tokugawa in 1789, it was already a historical document, describing skills that were no longer actively practiced. A few families maintained fragments of training in secret, passed down as ancestral knowledge, but the organized, clan-based shinobi system was effectively dead. The transition to an era without internal wars fundamentally changed what ninja meant. During the Sengoku period, they were tactical assets in existential conflicts between rival powers. In the Edo period, they became enforcers of stability, tools of a centralized state more interested in preventing conflict than winning it. That shift stripped away much of the mystique and autonomy that had defined the profession. A ninja working for a warlord could still imagine themselves as independent contractors, selling skills to the highest bidder. A ninja working for the Tokugawa was an employee of the state, with all the constraints and surveillance that implied. Some former shinobi adapted successfully, finding niches in the new order. Others struggled, their skills obsolete and their identities tied to a profession that no longer existed. A few turned to crime, using their training for banditry or smuggling, activities that occasionally appear in Edo period crime records. Though officials rarely acknowledged the perpetrators' backgrounds, most simply disappeared into civilian life, their histories quietly buried, their children never told what their grandparents had once been. By 1700, the ninja as a functional profession was gone from official records. What remained were myths, half-remembered stories, and a cultural memory that would eventually be reshaped by later generations into something very different from what the shinobi had actually been. The real ninja, documented, confirmed, verifiable, had faded into history. What replaced them was something far more complicated. Because when historians finally began sifting through the fragments, cross-referencing archives, and separating myth from fact, the picture that emerged wasn't the one popular culture had painted, and the question that lingered wasn't, were ninja real, but how much of what they actually did has been forgotten, distorted, or deliberately hidden? When historians cross-reference surviving ninja manuals like the Bansenshukai and Shoninki with daimyo archives, military chronicles, and regional records, a consistent picture emerges, not of supernatural warriors, but of highly trained specialists whose documented methods align remarkably well across independent sources. The scarcity of evidence is itself revealing. Shinobi operations were designed to leave minimal traces, no names in official documents, no public acknowledgement, and deliberate destruction of records after missions concluded. What survived did so either because it served a political purpose, like Tokugawa records of the Iga crossing that legitimized their use of ninja, or because it was buried so deeply in administrative paperwork that no one thought to destroy it. The consistency of what little remains is more significant than its volume. Independent sources separated by geography and political alignment describe the same core tactics: infiltration, intelligence gathering, sabotage, and psychological warfare. The gap between myth and documented practice is stark. Popular imagination gives us acrobatic assassins with magical powers. Historical records describe patient intelligence operatives who spent months in cover identities, rarely killed anyone directly, and relied on mundane skills like observation, coded communication, and understanding human psychology. The Bansenshukai dedicates far more space to espionage, tradecraft, disguise, and survival techniques than to combat. When fighting is discussed, it's defensive and pragmatic. How to escape, how to survive long enough to complete the mission, not how to duel dramatically. Certain methods repeat across every documented source. Disguise as low-status civilians, servants, merchants, laborers, appears constantly because it worked. Night operations and movement during weather that limited visibility are standard in both training manuals and mission reports. Use of fire as both weapon and diversion is documented in multiple campaigns, from Iga's resistance to operations in Korea. Intelligence gathering through passive observation rather than active interrogation dominates the records, reflecting the reality that staying invisible was more valuable than dramatic action. What remains controversial is scale and frequency. We know shinobi existed and were used in documented operations, but how many missions happened that left no trace? Some historians argue ninja operations were relatively rare and overstated by later mythologizing. Others point to the gaps in records, especially the systematic destruction of documents during the Tokugawa transition, and suggest that what survived is a tiny fraction of what actually occurred. Both positions have merit, and the truth likely sits somewhere in between, more common than skeptics admit, less ubiquitous than popular culture suggests. The best documented missions form a clear hierarchy of evidence. The Iga crossing that saved Tokugawa Ieyasu is confirmed across multiple independent sources with consistent core details. Operations at Ueda in 1597 are verified by both Sanada and Tokugawa records. The infiltrations during Sekigahara and at Azuchi Castle have fragmentary but cross-referenced confirmation. Intelligence work during the Korean campaigns appears in both Japanese and Korean archives, though with different interpretations of effectiveness. These aren't myths added later. They're contemporaneous accounts that survived because they were too significant to erase completely. Modern historians have dramatically revised their assessment of shinobi over the past few decades. Earlier scholarship, influenced by both dismissive attitudes toward dishonorable tactics and contamination from popular fiction, often treated ninja as marginal figures or outright fabrications. Recent work, especially by researchers with access to previously untranslated sources and better methodologies for separating folklore from documentary evidence, has established that shinobi were integral to Sengoku period warfare and early Tokugawa governance. They weren't peripheral curiosities. They were core components of how power operated in feudal Japan. The real impact of ninja operations on Japanese history is significant but unquantifiable. We can point to specific moments where shinobi intervention changed outcomes. Ieyasu's escape, ensuring Tokugawa dominance, intelligence operations at Sekigahara, enabling crucial betrayals, Iga's resistance delaying Nobunaga's unification by years. But how many other decisions, battles, and political shifts were shaped by intelligence we can't trace? How many wars were avoided, alliances broken, or strategies abandoned because of information gathered by operatives whose names were never written down? What the documents ultimately reveal is a profession that existed in the tension between necessity and invisibility. Feudal lords needed covert capabilities, but couldn't publicly acknowledge using them. Shinobi provided essential services, but couldn't demand recognition without undermining their effectiveness. The result was a historical record designed to obscure as much as it recorded, and yet, even through that obscurity, enough survived to confirm that the ninja were real, their operations documented, and their impact on Japan's history far larger than the fragments suggest. Which leaves one final uncomfortable question. If this much survived despite systematic efforts to erase it, what incredible operations succeeded so perfectly that even historians looking directly at the evidence still can't see them? Historical records leave no doubt that ninja were real and that some of their missions are authentically documented. Chronicles, daimyo archives, and manuals like the Bansenshukai and Shoninki confirm the existence of shinobi as specialized intelligence agents used for infiltration, reconnaissance, sabotage, and covert escort operations, especially by clans in Iga and Kōga. These sources align on core methods: disguise, night movement, coded communication, map tampering, supply attacks, and psychological disruption, and they tie specific operations, like the Iga resistance, Ueda defenses, the Ieyasu escape, and Sekigahara intelligence to identifiable outcomes in Japanese history. Beyond what can be proved, there is a second layer, missions that almost certainly existed but are lost to time. Covert work is designed not to leave a paper trail, and later regimes had every incentive to destroy or sanitize records that showed how much their power depended on espionage, betrayal, and clandestine violence. The few missions we can track, through double-sided documentation, cross-referenced chronicles, or surviving manuals, imply a much larger volume of everyday operations. Long-term infiltrations that never surfaced in official reports, quiet assassinations written off as accidents or illness, and intelligence coups that altered decisions without anyone outside a tiny circle ever knowing why. If the documented cases are the operations that had to be acknowledged, the truly perfect missions are the ones history never realized were ninja work at all. And that is why the real operations are more impressive than any myth. Legends give us impossible stunts and supernatural powers. The documents show small teams with no magic at all, quietly shaping the destinies of clans and eventually an entire country, using nothing but patience, planning, and an almost inhuman tolerance for risk and anonymity. No special effects are needed. Getting a future shogun out of enemy territory alive, sabotaging an invasion with map edits and bridge failures, or turning the tide of a decisive battle through timely intelligence is, in cold historical terms, more astonishing than any fireball. If you want more stories where the real history is more shocking than the fiction, make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. Because every time we go back to the records and ask what they still haven't told us, we get closer to seeing how much of the past was decided by people history never intended us to notice.